Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show is for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, whether that's at work or at home, which means it's pretty much for everyone, especially people in professional positions whose job means taking care of fuel because they need it to get the job done, whatever that job may happen to be. So, if you think that sounds at least a little bit like you, then the Fuel Pulse Show is going to be for you. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, today I wanted to do something a little bit different. Most of our episodes involve interviews and discussions with other professionals in the fuels industry, whether that's fuel service professionals, tank manufacturers, hospital administrators, operations and fleet managers, people who can talk about what's happening in their particular sphere of influence, and hopefully pass along some interesting things that you, the audience, might not have known or might be interested in. Well, today we're going to switch it up a bit, where it's just going to be me. Now, I am the technical director for Bell Performance in Central Florida, and our primary business is that we formulate problem-solving solutions for petroleum fuels. And I myself have been in the position of technical director at Bell Performance for about 15 years. And over that time, I have been asked a lot of questions, and some questions tend to come up more often than others. So today, we're going to talk about one of these questions, and that is, how have fuels changed from the past? How are fuels different than they used to be? And there's a lot to be said about that, so let's get started. So the question that comes up is, are the fuels of today the same as the fuels of the past? And if not, then why not? Or how are they different? How have they changed? When we talk about fuels and the nexus of fuel problems, why fuels today have problems, we usually have to go back and start at this point. Talk about how the fuels of today are different than they used to be and why that is. This is really where you do have to start if you're considering questions like, why does my fuel have problems? It never used to have them. Why is it having problems now? Or is this fuel that I have in the storage tank going to have problems in the future, and what can I do about it? So let's start with the basics when we're answering this question. But let's talk about those basics in a way that is easy for the average person to understand. So the bottom line, maybe Cliff Notes answer to this question of how have fuels changed, is that fuels have changed because of three big factors, if you will. The first is the change in refining methods. That's number one. Number two is because of the removal of sulfur and the impact of government regulations on fuel requirements. We'll put it that way. That's number two. And then number three is, which is related to number two, is the influx or the addition of biofuels and how that impacts today's fuels. So let's talk about the first one, refining methods. So in order to talk about this, we have to go a little bit back to the beginning and talk about crude oil and talk about the refining of diesel fuel from crude oil. So most of us start from the knowledge standpoint that we know that crude oil comes out of the ground and then it goes to a refinery, and the refinery essentially splits it up into the usable components that go out into the marketplace and are purchased and used by those in the marketplace. And there are a number of different things that they get from crude oil. But we can divide those things up into two very general categories, if you will. And those are distillate components and residual components. Now, we'll talk about why that matters here in a minute, because what we have to talk about is the situation of the worldwide demand for energy, the worldwide demand for crude oil components. Um, as you know, the kind of things that we get out of crude oil are things like natural gas, different types of fuels that people burn. So natural gas, propane, um, kerosene, and Jet A, and number one diesel fuel, number two diesel fuel, home heating oil, of course, gasoline and naphtha. Um, and we bring those things up because uh, the demand for those kinds of things is ever increasing over time. We'll put it that way. And the demand for those things does not have a ceiling. In other words, there are more people who are wanting to use gasoline and diesel fuel for vehicles than there were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. But you can't say that in 50 years we're going to reach a cap of X amount. Basically, the demand for energy keeps going up and up and up and up, and there's no ceiling to it. However, there is a ceiling to the things that you can use to satisfy that demand. Now, why are we talking about it this way? Why does that matter? Well, when you talk about the fact that demand doesn't have a ceiling, okay, we talk about the fact that the demand for energy is very much different than it was 30 years ago, and that is partly because of what's happened in third world countries over the last 30 or 40 years. Thomas Friedman wrote a book, we'll say 15 years ago. My dates may not be exactly right, but Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat. And the thesis of the book was talking about how the world is changing, and it's essentially getting smaller, figuratively speaking. He termed it as it's flattening out. And what he meant was that while it's not literally flattening out, of course, but the way that we relate to each other around the world has changed. So somebody in Beijing, China is still, I don't know, 5,000 miles or 6,000 miles away from somebody in Los Angeles. That hasn't changed. However, the fact that a person in Beijing can talk to a person in Los Angeles in a fraction of a millisecond, that's very much different than it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. The world has changed, and there are a number of areas where it does not look like it used to. And one of those areas is in the fact that there are now billions of people who used to be in the third world, but they're now doing things that used to be first world province only, if you will. Take internet usage, for example. Most Americans probably still think of the internet as kind of a first world thing. So, how many people do we have in the United States that use the internet? Well, the United States has, let's say, 330, 350 million people. And let's say that for a round figure, 300 million of those use the internet. Pretty much everybody who's not a little kid uses the internet. So we have 300 million internet users. So we think that, we're essentially the center of that universe. However, you go over to China, okay? Now, we all know that China is the most populous nation in the world. We also know that there are a lot of parts of China that are, pretty poor. But did you know that China actually has, how many internet users do you think China has? Um, China has about 1 billion people who use the internet. Take India. India has got a lot of parts that are really, really poor. But yet India has almost, 700 million people who use the internet. And we in the United States are sitting here with 300 million people who use it. Um, that's kind of an example of how there's greater demand across the world for things that used to be only be used by people in the first world. And that concept applies to energy usage and fuel usage. There are billions of people in China and India and Indonesia and other, Malaysia and other third world countries who are essentially coming online in terms of energy usage. They are buying cars, they're burning, using electricity, all that kind of things. They're using energy. And so what that means is worldwide demand for energy and for fossil fuels in particular keeps going up and up and up, and we don't know where that ceiling is going to be. Now, remember we said that the ceiling for energy usage, it's a floating one. There's no hard ceiling. However, there is essentially a finite amount of petroleum that we have to satisfy that. And we're going to leave all the other kinds of energy usage out of there, mainly stick to petroleum. So while demand has increased, the amount of petroleum that we're extracting has stayed, we'll say, relatively static because it's a finite amount, right? And not only that, but the ability to take that unrefined petroleum, that raw petroleum, and turn it into the things that will satisfy the demand of the people who are using energy, that ability has also stayed static as well. Now, let's dig a little bit closer into this and then bring it around to how this relates to how fuels have changed. In the United States, if you talk about the amount of gasoline, the amount of diesel that we use, let's say, from cars, generally speaking, 30 years ago, we used, and I'm going to quote some figures that are generally correct. There were about 10, we used about, or we had a demand in terms of the amount of fuel that we needed to use on a daily basis in order to do what we want to do in the United States. We would use about 10.5 million barrels per day of crude oil to produce that fuel. Now, who produces that fuel? It's the refineries. That crude oil goes to the refinery. The refinery, as we said at the very beginning, are the ones that process it and split it up and turn it into the gasoline and the diesel and the natural gas and the things that these engines use. So 10.5 million barrels a day. We had about 300 refineries that ran, processed that fuel to turn it into those components. But what has happened is there are a couple things that have happened in the last 30 years. Now, think about the number of cars, the number of trucks that are on the road. We have a lot more people that are driving, right? So we have more people using more gasoline and more on-road diesel. The cars and trucks themselves are a lot more efficient than they used to be. So you've got one factor where the demand's going up. You've got another thing where the engines that use that fuel have gotten better and a lot more efficient at using it. And so today, we still use about 10.5 to 11 million barrels a day of crude oil to produce that fuel. So that amount has stayed about the same. It's really a testimony or testament to the engineers who have produced more and more efficient vehicles. However, 30 years ago, we had 300 refineries that are producing that gas and diesel. We don't have 300 refineries anymore. Now we have closer to, let's say, 180 refineries, maybe even less than that. What has happened is that refineries have closed, and the remaining refineries, people don't exactly like building refineries. So we haven't really built new refineries. We may not even have built a new refinery in, I don't know, X number of years. So we have a lot fewer refineries, but they're still producing the same amount of gas and diesel. So they've gotten a lot better, a lot more efficient at producing fuel. Now, why does this matter? Well, they have a finite amount of petroleum to work with, but they're being demanded to produce more and more fuel. So what they have had to do ever since about 1970, they have had to come up with ways to uh, uh, squeeze more distillate fuel out of the barrels of crude oil that they're processing. So remember that we said the components of crude oil that are refined out of it can be classified into two camps, distillate and residual. So the distillate fuels, when the refinery is breaking apart that crude, refining that crude oil, they use a distillation column and they heat the crude oil up and they vaporize it, and then it goes up and then it starts condensing from the top down, and the lighter components condense, essentially turn back into liquid or gas, depending on what they are. They come off first, they're taken off first, and then as you work your way down the column, the larger and heavier, progressively larger and progressively heavier components come off until you get to the point where the residue is what's left, and that is what the residual fuels are. So what are these different kinds of components? Well, starting at the very top, you have the gaseous components. So you have all the things that are termed as natural gas. So I don't know, methane, propane, butane, and all the mixtures of those gases. The things that have the really small molecules, the 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbon, 4 carbon molecules. So those are taken off first. Once you get past the gaseous ones, then you start getting to the liquids, and you start getting to, you have naphtha, then you have gasoline, and as we're going down, the molecules in these fuels are getting progressively bigger and bigger and bigger. So naphtha, gasoline, then you have kerosene and Jet A and number 1 diesel fuel. And then you have number 2 diesel fuel oil, which is what people think of when they think of on-road diesel. You have home heating oil, which is essentially off-road number 2 diesel. And then number 4, and once you get past number 4 diesel, now you're getting to the residual. And the residual stuff is the stuff that's larger and heavier. It's dirtier because it's got a lot higher sulfur content, a lot higher metallic content. The molecules are much larger, and so you've got number 6 fuel oil, which is also called heavy fuel oil or bunker C fuel oil. And you've got the stuff down at the very end, which is like tar and asphalt, things like that. And so that's basically the order of distillation, the order of refining, if you will, in a refinery. Now, why are we talking about this? There's a purpose for why we're saying this. Before 1970, when they would refine a barrel of crude oil, they would get about, and I'm going to try and remember these percentages off the top of my head, but about 55% of each barrel of crude oil would be taken off as distillate fuel. So your gas and your diesel and your natural gas and those kinds of things, your kerosene, would compose just over half of each barrel of crude oil. What they did was they said, we've got to figure out a way to get more gasoline and more diesel fuel and more of those kinds of things out of each barrel of crude oil. And so what they did is they came up with methods that they call cracking methods. And what the cracking methods did was enable them to increase that percentage of distillate fuel that they got out of each barrel of crude oil, so that instead of just over half of each barrel, today they can get 90, 92, 93% of each barrel of crude oil is now distillate fuel. Now, how do they do this? Well, it can get kind of complicated, as any petroleum chemist will tell you. The simplest way to explain it is that what they have done is they have taken the distillate, the residual things, the things that have the really large molecules. Okay, so let's say, for example, that you want to get more gasoline and more diesel fuel out of your crude. Gasoline tends to have molecules that are of a size that have, let's say, 8 carbons, 9 carbons, 10 carbons. For this example, let's say the gasoline is gasoline molecules are 10 carbons long, if you will. Diesel fuel, on-road diesel fuel number 2, their molecules are bigger and heavier. Let's say that their molecules are 20 carbons long. They're probably a little bit smaller than that, but for the sake of our example, let's say 20 molecules of carbons long. Now, remember 1970, they were getting 55% of the crude oil they could pull off as gasoline and diesel. Now they're taking some of that residual tar, and let's say they have a molecule of tar or a molecule of asphalt, and it's much, much bigger than the molecules of gasoline and diesel. Instead of 10 or 20 carbons, let's say that it's 100 carbons long. What they will do is they will come up with methods to essentially crack or break it apart and chop it up, essentially, for lack of a better way of putting it, chop it up into these smaller molecules. So they take a molecule of asphalt that's 100 carbons long, and they chop it up. Let's say they chop it up into 10 molecules of gasoline, 10 times 10, or 5 molecules of diesel fuel, 5 times 20. So what they have been able to do is they have now been able to increase their yield of gasoline and diesel simply by breaking apart the molecules of the residual fuels that they didn't used to be able to do that for in the past. So at this point, we're saying, great, we're getting a boatload more gasoline and diesel, life's good. But there's always a consequence when you do these kinds of things. And the consequence is that when you split apart the molecules in the way that they're doing, what you end up with is you end up with gasoline and diesel molecules that can be refined and blended and increase your yield of those fuels. However, those molecules aren't exactly the same as what we might call straight run gasoline or straight run diesel. They have more double bonds in them because, as a chemist will tell you, when you split a molecule, you break a carbon-to-carbon bond. In order to keep it stable, it creates double bonds in the two molecules that were, the two resulting molecules. Now, that would be okay, except double bonds are less stable and they're more prone to reacting with things than straight run single bonded molecules are. And so what has happened is that we have more and more what we will call cracked fuel stocks, or gasoline and diesel made from cracked fuel stocks. More and more of that's out in our fuel supply, but they have more double bonds in them, and that means that they are less stable over time, and they do things that the fuels of the 60s and the 70s didn't used to do. Their stability life is a lot shorter. They darken faster. They form sediments and gums and varnishes a lot faster. That is one of the primary reasons why fuels of today are different or have changed than fuels of the past. And that means if you're going to solve those problems, you have to do things like, let's say, add fuel stabilizers to diesel fuel, whereas before 1970 you did not have to do that. So that's reason number one as to why fuels have changed from the past. Okay, reason number two, the creation of ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel and the impact of environmental regulations on the fuel supply. Okay, so there's a lot that we can say about this, and you know we're trying not to go 2 hours here, so we'll see if we can condense this into something a little bit shorter than that. Okay, so the creation of ultra low sulfur diesel, when we talk about that, we're talking about the fact that over a period of 25 years, starting from the early 90s up until around 2006, 2007, they removed about 99.7% of the sulfur that used to be in diesel fuel. Now, what are we talking about here? You know, what do we mean by that? Well, let's go back, start to talk about crude oil, right? Crude oil is it's a natural thing. It's made from natural components, essentially dead dinosaurs, if you will, dead plants and dead dinosaurs. And crude oil has a lot of carbon in it, which is why you can refine fuels from it. However, it's also got a lot of things like metals, aluminums, calcium, iron, I don't know, not cobalt, but those kinds of things. Magnesium. It's got a lot of metals. It also has a lot of sulfur in it. Now, when you burn something, that combustion process is a series of chemical reactions. It's a chain reaction of chemical reactions where all those carbon-carbon bonds are being broken and you're liberating heat energy, and that's why combustion involves heat. It releases heat energy from those bonds. But the general rule, though, is that, remember, laws of conservation of energy and so forth. The elements that you start out with, those do not just disappear. All that happens to those is they get rearranged into other forms. So what happens to those carbons? When you burn something, when you have complete combustion, what happens is all those carbons, they get their bonds broken, and then they will react and form bonds with the oxygen that's being supplied in the air. And so that's why you will get carbon dioxide formed, or carbon monoxide if you have incomplete combustion. What happens to the aluminum and the iron and those metals? Well, those don't form carbon dioxide. What happens is those oxidize, they react with oxygen from the air, and they form ash components. So when you burn charcoal, right, or when you burn wood in your fireplace, all that ash that's left, those are all the non-carbon components of that wood, essentially a bunch of metal oxides. But the key thing is that the aluminum and the iron, those things don't just disappear. They just form new things, if you will. Now, crude oil has a lot of sulfur in it. Now, when you refine crude oil, again, that stuff has to go somewhere. Certain amount of it will end up in the fuels that are refined. Now, before the early 90s, when you had diesel fuel, you were allowed to have up to about 5,000 what they call parts per million of sulfur. Now, parts per million from a chemistry standpoint can be volumetric, like 1 gallon per 4,000 gallons of something. In this case, it's weight. So 5,000 parts per million essentially means about 0.5% of the weight of that diesel fuel is or was sulfur atoms or sulfur compounds, if you will. So that was allowed. Now, when you burn that diesel fuel, what happens to that sulfur? It has to go somewhere, and what happens is that it essentially reacts with oxygen, and it forms sulfur dioxide. Some of it forms sulfur trioxide, which we'll talk about in a minute, but most of it forms SO2. Each molecule of sulfur uh, reacts with two atoms of oxygen from the air, it forms SO2, and it leaves the tailpipe or leaves the combustion stream, essentially goes out into the air. Now, some of that, like we said, actually oxidizes with a third atom of oxygen, forms SO3. Now, what would happen, and those of you who were alive in the 70s and 80s probably know where I'm going with this. If there was any SO3 that was formed, and usually about 1 to 2% of the sulfur dioxide that's formed in any combustion situation ends up becoming SO3. So that SO3 goes out into the air, out into the environment. And what happens to it? What happens is that it would usually will come across some water vapor that's somewhere. And you'll get H2O reacting with SO3. And what do you think that forms? Right. It forms sulfuric acid. And in nature, the form that would take is that would get diluted essentially, and it would form dilute sulfuric acid rain. Acid rain falls on the forest, kills the trees. We don't like that. We want forests. We like forests. And people got really concerned about acid rain, and rightly so. We're not minimizing this by any means. That's a concern. That was a concern. So people are saying we need to do something about this. So Congress says, you're right. We need to do something about this. Now, the question was, what can you do about something like this? Remember, the stuff that you start with in the fuel, you end with. That's why that sulfur was going out into the environment in the first place, because you started with it. So what Congress said was, we're going to pass legislation as part of the Clean Air Act, or part of one of the multiple iterations of the Clean Air Act. And we are going to require the refineries to remove most of the sulfur before that fuel goes out into the marketplace. And so they created legislation around 1991, and they said, you are now required to create what we're going to call low sulfur diesel fuel. And the maximum amount of sulfur that you're allowed to have in diesel fuel, we're going to reduce that. We used to say you could have 5,000 parts per million. Now you can only have 500 parts per million. So they've reduced it by 90%. So from the early 90s all the way through to the early to mid 2000s, the on-road diesel fuel that you would buy had 90% less sulfur than the diesel fuel that you could buy in the 80s. And, by and large, it did what they needed it to do. There's 90% less sulfur going out into the air, which means 90% less sulfur to create acid rain and destroy the forest. So around 2006, they said, well, that works so well, let's go one better. And so in 2006, they passed an update, essentially, and they said, okay, now we're going to lower the amount of sulfur you're allowed even further. Now, instead of 500 parts per million, you can only have 15, 15. So in the space, as I said at the very beginning, in the space of about 25 years, the amount of sulfur that was in diesel fuel went from 5,000 parts per million to 15 parts per million, a reduction of about 99.7% in about 25 years. Now, like I said, it did what it was supposed to do. It was great for the environment, but it changed certain properties of the fuel and caused the fuel to be different in certain ways. So what ways are we talking about? The cold flow properties of the fuel were different. It gelled at higher temperatures. This new ultra low sulfur diesel fuel tended to hold on to water better. So we would say it had a higher affinity for water. It had less lubricity. And if you are a fleet manager, you know about lubricity. The fact that sulfur components in the diesel fuel, when they were in there, they helped contribute to lubricating parts of the fuel injectors and the fuel pumps. The fuel pumps and the fuel injectors relied on that inherent lubrication from the fuel. You take all that sulfur out and destroy those sulfur related components, the lubricating ability of the fuel went way down. But the market adjusted to that. The market created lubricity treatments to restore that lubricity. And then later, we'll mention with biofuels, the addition of biodiesel also helped to solve that issue. So that was thought to be a huge issue at the beginning, but the marketplace solved that. But a really big one, what I think is the biggest problem for ultra low sulfur diesel fuel, and the biggest thing that we would bring up when we say how are today's fuels different and have more problems than the fuels of the 70s and 80s and before, is that today's ultra low sulfur diesel fuels are much, much less resistant to microbial growth than the fuels of the past. Now, why is that? We always ask, why is that in these situations? Well, people used to think that it was because of the removal of the sulfur, or not the removal of the sulfur, but the fact that the sulfur was not there anymore. So if you read literature, any technical literature from, let's say 10 years ago, you might see certain things that say stuff like, sulfur is a natural biocide, and that when they removed the sulfur, the sulfur that was there before killed the microbes or kept them from growing. And so you take that out and the microbes say, yay, there's no sulfur in it anymore. Well, that's not exactly correct. Sulfur is not a natural biocide. A biocide is something that kills microbes. At best, you could say sulfur is what they call a biostat. And a biostat is something that tends to make it less hospitable for microbes to grow. But it's not the same as a biocide, which is a legal term for something that actually kills active living things like microbes. So when they would say sulfur is a natural biocide, that's not correct. Because if that were true, then you could take crude oil, which has tens of thousands of parts per million of sulfur in it, and microbes would never grow in that. But though people who are in the fuels industry, people who deal with crude oil will tell you, yes, microbes can grow in crude oil, and they do grow in crude oil. So no, in reality, the reason why today's ultra low sulfur diesel fuels are much less resistant to microbial growth than they used to be is because of what happens as a result of the processing that's used to take out the sulfur. They use what they call hydroprocessing methods at the refinery. And what happens is that the sulfur comes out, certain types of sulfurous molecules are also destroyed. But then what also happens is, at the same time as they're taking the sulfur out, there's another government regulation that is coming into play at the same time. Because when the government said, we're going to make this fuel better for the environment, so you're going to take the sulfur out, they didn't just change that. What they also did at the same time is they put a cap on what they call the aromatic content of diesel fuel. Now, aromatic, when you think aromatic, you think of, something that smells, hopefully good, but that's not exactly what we're talking about here. Now, if any of you have a chemistry background, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So for those of us who do not have a chemistry background, this is the simple way to explain it. In the world of chemistry and in the world of hydrocarbons, which are the types of molecules that make up crude oil and make up gasoline and diesel, you have two broad, and we're talking in broad categories here, two broad categories of molecules. You have what are called aliphatic, Aliphatic, aliphatic hydrocarbons. What those are straight chain hydrocarbons. So you've got carbon, 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 carbon. Now you can have double bonds in there, and you can have things that come off of it like oxygen molecules and metals might come up, whatever. But the root of them, the base of them, are a straight chain, some kind of straight chain of hydrocarbons. And when you talk about aliphatic hydrocarbons, many of the things that you can think of are at their root aliphatic hydrocarbons. Ethyl alcohol, ethanol. Ethanol is a very simple aliphatic hydrocarbon. It's a carbon, 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 and it's got an OH group on the end. So it's a chain of two, essentially. Propane is an aliphatic hydrocarbon. There are all sorts of them. So that's the first category. But then the other, if something isn't an aliphatic hydrocarbon, then it is an aromatic. An aromatic means it has what they call benzene rings. There are certain other kinds of aromatics. Again, we're speaking in generalities here. If you have ever seen any kind of chemistry diagrams, and you have seen a something that looks like a hexagon, a 6-point polygon, where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it comes back around. And the thing is if you ever see there's like a circle in the middle, that is essentially chemistry shorthand for an aromatic ring, or what they call a benzene ring. And we won't go into the vagaries of what all that means. But the important thing for us to understand in the context of what we're talking about here is that when you're formulating diesel fuel, it's going to be a certain percentage of aliphatic hydrocarbons, and then the rest of that is going to be a given percentage of aromatic hydrocarbons. And the refinery can change those proportions. So both of those will burn in an engine. Both of those provide energy. However, when you burn aromatic fuels that have a high proportion of aromatic content, a high proportion of benzene rings and benzene type constituents, the combustion emissions that you get, those tend to contribute more to air pollution, to smog, to ground level ozone. So aromatics tend to produce more things that are bad for air quality, definitely bad for the health of the developing lungs of children in urban settings, which are the settings where you get more of this stuff concentrated. So when the EPA was making these rules, they said, okay, you're going to take out the sulfur because that's bad for the environment, but we're also going to lower the cap on the amount of aromatics that you can have in the fuel, because we need to do something about the air quality, and that's one thing that we can do. We can reduce sulfur and we can lower the aromatic content. So when you lower the aromatic content, by necessity, that means a greater proportion is going to be the aliphatics. Now again, when you're burning that in a diesel engine, the diesel engine burns all of that just fine. But when we're talking about microbes, when microbes want to grow in fuel, they will use components of the fuel as fuel, essentially as food. And microbes don't particularly like to be around aromatics that much. They don't like to consume aromatics, but they love to consume aliphatics, aliphatic hydrocarbons. And so one of the consequences, maybe unintended consequences, that resulted from the removal of the sulfur and the concurrent lowering of the lowering of the caps, on the amount of aromatics you could have in there, is it created diesel fuel where microbes could grow and multiply much more easily. And that is a big difference between today's diesel fuels and the diesel fuels of 30 or 40 years ago. So that's the second big way on how fuels have changed. And in other podcast episodes, we probably will talk about things that you can do to ameliorate this this problem. Basically, the short answer for what can I do if I have a microbial problem in my fuel is you have to use a biocide to kill it. You probably have to remove any water bottom that's in it, but that is a topic for another show. What we're talking about today is the why. Why the fuels of today are the way they are. Okay, third thing. This one also relates to government regulation, and that is the prevalence or the increasing prevalence of biofuels. Now, when we talk about biofuels, we really mean two main things. I mean, there are a number of different really kind of minor players in the landscape of biofuels, but for our purposes, we're really only concerned with two main ones, and they are ethanol and biodiesel. Now, most people are familiar with the ethanol situation because ethanol is what goes into gasoline. And from a B2B standpoint, there's not that much intersection with ethanol because most of the B2B fuel usage, whether it's stored fuel or for fleets, most of that's diesel fuel. So what we're going to concentrate on here is biodiesel. So why is there biodiesel? Why are biodiesel and ethanol and other kinds of biofuels, why are they such a significant part of our national fuels picture? Well, we can go back again to government regulations and the fact that over the years the government started changing the rules to try and make fuels better for the environment. So while they were taking sulfur out and limiting aromatic content, they also said we need to do some additional things to try and make the fuel, when it's burned, make those emissions better for the environment. And so for gasoline, what they did is they said, we're going to require you to put what we call oxygenates in gasoline. And they were doing this in the 1980s. If you increase the oxygen content of any kind of fuel, you make it, for lack of a better way of putting it, you make it burn better for the environment. The combustion components are not as bad, if you will. It's a very simple way of putting it, I know. So they were doing that with gasoline and ethanol. But on the diesel side, excuse me, what they started doing was they started requiring the addition of biodiesel into the diesel fuel supply. Now, the specific legislation that this requirement came from was a part of a bigger piece of legislation called the Renewable Fuels Standard, or the RFS. Now, the Renewable Fuels Standard is congressional legislation. So it's Congress that essentially every year Congress will take stock of the national fuels picture, if you will, and they will say, okay, next year we are going to require as part of law that the country use this many gallons, and in our case, countrywide, it's this many billions of gallons of renewable fuels in the national fuel supply in the coming year. Usually sometime after the middle of the previous year is when they make that announcement. So in the Renewable Fuel Standard, they will dictate both ethanol and biodiesel usage. And so as an aside, if you're ever at a cocktail party and people are talking about how they don't like, ethanol or biodiesel, and what do people usually say when they talk about that? They say, oh, the government is interfering in our business, right? And Who will they blame usually? They will usually talk about the EPA. They'll say, oh, the EPA, they're butting into our business. They shouldn't be doing that, whatever. And just as an aside, just as a point of information, the EPA in this context doesn't set these rules. The EPA is one of the groups that enforces or implements. Enforcing is not really the right word. Implements this through their own regulations. But at its heart, this is a congressional issue. So if you are one of the people who do not like ethanol in your gasoline, for example, what you would be wise, what you would want to do is you would want to talk to your congressperson, because Congress is the one that sets these rules. The EPA is simply the one of a number of groups tasked with implementing the wishes of Congress. Okay, so in the 2000s, we started getting more biodiesel into our national fuel supply. So any diesel fuel, there's a couple of things to remember here. Any diesel fuel that you buy at a filling station or at a truck stop, and you go there, you see diesel fuel, I know, $5 a gallon, however much it is. Every gallon of diesel fuel that's sold, on-road diesel fuel, has at least a little bit of biodiesel in it. It's usually 2%, 3%. It may have up to 5%. The thing is, though, is that it's not labeled as having that. And there's a reason for that. You think that you're just buying straight run 100% number 2 diesel fuel, but what you're actually buying is, let's say, 97% diesel fuel and 3% biodiesel. And they can legally do that. They can legally not disclose that it has 3% biodiesel in it. And the reason that is because the EPA has determined that you can go up to 5% biodiesel content and it still have the same specifications that regular diesel fuel has. And so from the EPA standpoint, if it meets what they call ASTM D975 specifications, if it meets all of the specifications, then legally they consider it to be diesel fuel, whether it's got 1%, 2%, 4.5% biodiesel in it or not. If you go above 5%, that's when you have to label it. And that's where you can see things like B20. When you see B20, that means it's got 20% biodiesel and 80% what we say petrodiesel, 80% regular diesel. Now, one last thing to say about that is when we say biodiesel, what we mean is the converted fat, essentially what they call the FAME, the methyl ester, the stuff that's converted, where they have taken the oil or the fat that they use as a feedstock, and they have chemically converted it into something that burns similarly enough to diesel fuel that you can use it in diesel engines as a fuel. Biodiesel, from a legal standpoint, the term biodiesel refers just to the converted fat, the methyl ester. A lot of people will say biodiesel when what they really mean is a biodiesel blend. The fuel that's created when you take X% of converted methyl ester and you mix it into regular diesel and you get a biodiesel blend, like a B20. So that's just something that's just terminology to keep straight, lest one becomes confused about these things. Okay, so the widespread inclusion of biodiesel is another way that today's fuels have fundamentally changed from 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Now, how does biodiesel make the fuel different? We already talked about how the removal of the sulfur has created issues in ultra low sulfur diesel fuel that you can get at the filling station. But what about biodiesel or biodiesel blends. How is that different? Well, environmentally, it's better. The emissions that are produced when it's burned in a diesel engine are better. It has less of the bad things in it, if you will. And that's primarily why they did it. It was to improve those emissions because they want to improve air quality. So in that sense, it's good. Also, the addition of remember the methyl ester, the biodiesel, the addition of that into ultra-low sulfur diesel solved that lubricity problem that they were really, really afraid of, because nobody wants to have fuel pumps and injectors burning out prematurely. Well, biodiesel, mixing just a little bit in, and we're only talking like 2%, restores all of that lubricity. So that's good. That's good for the consumer. That's good for the fuels professional. But the problems that can be created by the addition of biodiesel into ultra-low sulfur diesel, it does increase the amount of water that it likes to hold on to. It does make it less inherently stable, and we already knew that ultra-low sulfur diesel already had problems in both of those areas. You add biodiesel to it, you've exacerbated those problems, and it makes microbial problems worse as well. So stability, more water affinity, more microbial problems. And so that is where we are at today. When somebody says, why are fuels, or how are fuels of today different than fuels of the past? We say, well, let's talk about three things. Let's talk about, we have more biofuels that are in our national fuel supply. We have ultra-low sulfur diesel that's inherently different. And we have a lot more cracked fuel stocks, which means the fuel is a lot less stable and develops more problems over time than the fuels of the past. Fortunately, there are ways to ameliorate all of the problems associated with this. That's what companies like mine tend to do. But when we're talking about this, and people say, why do I need a biocide, or why do I need a stabilizer for the stored fuel? Depending on how much time we have, we will have to talk about some of these issues. And so those three main things are why fuels of today are different and have more problems than fuels of the past. So that about wraps things up for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show. Thanks for spending a part of your day with me. Check out the show notes at our website for links to some of the things that we talked about today. You can find those at www.bellperformance.com. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you happen to get your podcasts at. And last but not least, if you liked what you heard, if you liked this podcast, then please leave us a review at your preferred site, because reviews, they're very important, and they're one of the most important ways that help people to find this show. So until next time, bye-bye everyone, and we'll catch you next time, the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.